There is a mountain in Bolivia that for 100 years produced 80% of the silver on Earth. It made the Spanish Empire the richest power on the planet, and it paid for cathedrals on the other side of the world. It even minted the coin that the United States dollar is descended from. Almost every man that dug silver out of this mountain died poor and in the dark, while a different set of men, who had probably never touched a pickaxe in their life, became some of the richest human beings that have ever lived. This is the story of Potosí, the mountain in the Bolivian Andes. 1545, 10 years after the Spanish smashed the Inca Empire. The story goes that the indigenous prospector named Diego is camped on a freezing red mountain high up in the Andes. He lights a fire to keep warm at night and wakes up to find that the heat has melted a trickle of pure silver from the ground beneath him. Well, here's the scale, and it's genuinely hard to believe. That story is probably a myth, but what Diego had just found, allegedly, was the biggest silver deposit ever found on Earth. Now, the silver that was wrote down averaged around 372 million ounces of silver a year. Now, the records were a joke. Everyone was smuggling. So the crown was actually skimming 20% off the top of anything mined, and nobody wanted to pay it. Prior to financial systems digitization, it was a lot harder to track this information, and so all the miners were smuggling. Now, that number is just the floor. When historians try to work out what really came out of the mountain, they can't agree because so much of it vanished off of the book. The honest range runs from 45,000 tons to 150,000 tons of silver per year. So somewhere between 1.5 and nearly 5 billion ounces of silver came out of a single hill, and they couldn't even count how much was coming out. That kind of money builds a city where no city should exist. 4,000 meters up in freezing cold air where almost nothing grows, Potosí swelled to 160,000 people, bigger than London at the time. One of the largest cities on Earth, in the middle of nowhere, all because of metal. The Spanish even turned Potosí into a word. When something was priceless, they said it was worth un Potosí. A Potosí. It even turns up in Don Quixote. The name of the city became a word for the fortune. It nearly died young. For 30 years, they just melted the rich surface ore in little furnaces. But the easy silver ran out fast, and by the 1560s, production was falling off a cliff. Potosí was on its way to becoming a ghost town. What saved it was mercury. In the 1570s, they brought in a new trick. They would grind the ore to a dust, mix it in mercury, and that binds to the silver and drags out the silver. Even from poor rock a furnace couldn't touch. Overnight, the whole mountain became worth mining again. The mercury came from another colonial mine in Peru, which was so lethal that they called it the mine of death. Remember the mercury, because it comes back to poison this entire story. Now, the man who turned all of this into a machine was a Spanish man by Francisco de Toledo, the name. He built the mint. He built dams and reservoirs to power the mills. And in 1573, he built the darkest part of all of it, the meter. The meter was forced labor, and every year the Spanish would conscript around 14,000 indigenous Incan men and march them from all around the highlands, often without their families, and feed them into the mountain and into the mills. A year at a time, with low pay, it was lethal work. Now, I'm not going to throw a death toll number at you, because the famous numbers come from a single book. And even the author admitted he hadn't done the rigor on those numbers. Nobody truly counted the dead because it was forced labor. In the minds of the rulers, they didn't matter. The records are clear that the work killed. There were cave-ins, there was exhaustion, and there was slow mercury poisoning. The people forced into the meter, for them, it was a catastrophe. So that's the setup, a mountain of silver, a mercury process to free all that silver from the dirt, and a forced army to do the freeing, which leaves the only question that actually matters in history. Who got rich? Well, Here's the part that nobody tells you, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. It wasn't actually the miners, it wasn't the mine owners even. Now, you'd assume that the rich men are the people that own the mountain, but they weren't. The mountain was chopped into 600 odd little shafts, owned by hundreds of different people, most of them barely scraping by, and a few of them obviously did quite well out of it. But owning a hole in the ground generally made you nothing. The money sat at the choke point, and the choke point wasn't digging the silver, it was the refining of it. Now, you remember that we needed the mercury to actually refine it. The silver only comes with the mercury, and mercury needs a mill. The water power, the gear, and the allocation of mercury forced workers from the crown. The men who owned those mills were called azogueros, from azogue, the Spanish word for mercury. The mercury men, if you will. And this is the whole game. Hundreds of men owned mines, but only about 75 owned the mills. They formed a guild. They negotiated with the king himself, and they never dug up a gram of silver. They just took a cut of everyone else's. You've heard of selling shovels? Well, how about selling refinery? Well, sitting above them was a tiny club of maybe 12 silver merchants who bought the finished bars, fed the mint, and lent everyone else their money. Picture the pyramid. At the bottom, you've got the workers, thousands dying in the dark and are poor. Then above them, you've got the mine owners, hundreds of them barely scraping by. Above them, you have the 75 refiners, genuinely getting rich here. And then right at the top of the pyramid, well, you've got the silver merchants that are buying the bars, they're selling them to the mints, and they're lending the cash out to the other businesses. It's almost embarrassingly modern, right? In any gold rush, the people who get rich aren't the ones holding the shovels. They're the ones who own the thing that everything that gets shoveled passes through. At Potosí, that was the mercury mill. It's the bottleneck, not the hole. Now, let's get into the story of the richest man, López de Quiroga. Nobody played that game better than him. If you remember one name from this video, it should be his, because he's the Henry Ford of Potosí. He turns up around 1648, a minor gentry immigrant from a poor corner of Spain, with no mine, no mountain, but a head for business. Well, he doesn't start as a miner. He starts as the money man, financing everyone else's mining. Then he marries into a wealthy merchant family. 3 years later, his father-in-law dies and leaves him running the entire estate. He had effectively struck more silver out of that than anybody else in this whole story. Now, 30 years old, he's sitting on some serious cash in one of the richest cities on earth. Here's his genius. Rather than being like most rich people and starting to diversify, he goes all in at the exact moment everyone else thinks Potosí is finished. When the easy silver's gone and the smart money starts running scared. He buys up mills and flooded, ridden off mines for next to nothing. He digs deep drainage tunnels to bring the dead ones back to life. He's one of the first men to blast the rock open with gunpowder. The result was Antonio becomes the single biggest silver producer in the entire Spanish Empire. From his operations alone, between 1661 and 1699, a 38-year period, came around 14 million ounces from one man, an eighth of the whole district. Well, he plants his relatives in government posts across the region to guard every last bit of it. There's vertical integration, and he's got political cover. It's fascinating. Here's what gets me though. With all of the money he was getting, the one thing he actually wanted was a noble title. He just wanted to be made an aristocrat, and he never got it. His rivals were too jealous, and they blocked him. He even burned money funding expeditions into the jungle to find a mythical lost city of gold. El Dorado, right? Well, the richest miner in the empire was chasing fantasies and a title that he'd die without. Henry Ford with the money, but Don Quixote with the dreams. Which brings us to the thing rotting at the center of it all. Now, the coins. Potosí was struck into a coin called the Rio Dia Ocho. I also touch on this in my recent silver video. The piece of eight. You know it from pirate films, but this was the most trusted money on the planet. It was accepted from China to Spain. By the king's own law, every coin was 93% pure silver. That purity was the entire reason that the world trusted it. Except the men running the Potosí mint were quietly putting less silver in the coins than the law demanded, and they were pocketing the difference for decades. It worked for an embarrassingly long time. Merchants as far away as the Middle East were complaining the coins felt less light as early as 1620s. But the way the officials covered it up is the ugliest thing in the story. When the silver came up short, they blamed enslaved Africans for stealing it. They debased the world's money and pinned it on the most powerless people in the city. The historians that have studied this compare it to Enron, to Bernie Madoff. Eventually, this issue got too big to bury, and in 1648, the King of Spain sent an investigator to clean house. The punishment was public. The mint's chief assayer and the city's own former magistrate, a rich and powerful man named Francisco Gomez de la Rocha, they were executed. They were put to death in the main square of Potosí, steps from the mint that they'd run. And the damage didn't just stay in Bolivia. The bad coins had gone everywhere, and the whole world had used this money. The moment the fraud broke, the most trusted currency on the planet became one of the least trusted almost overnight. A Spanish decree in 1650 said the fake coins had been destroyed. That the fake coins had destroyed the credit and the money of Spain, the public faith, and the conservation of universal trade. The public faith, universal trade, and one mountain that had made so many people rich had overthrown this trust. Potosí didn't end with a bang. The silver got harder to reach, the easy money dried up, and the city bled out. By the time Bolivia had won its independence in 1820s, the place that once rivaled London was about down to 10,000 people. But for 200 years, one red mountain round the world, and it leaves you with something that hasn't changed in 5 centuries. The wealth never goes to the people that are doing the digging.